Listen to the heavy, ragged breath echoing off cold stone. Here, in the damp, claustrophobic silence of the labyrinth, dwells a prince born of a queen, yet condemned as a monster. Welcome to Somnolent. We look beyond the horns and the hunger. This is not just a myth about a beast. It is a tragedy born from the sins of a father and the darkness inherent in civilization itself. To understand the darkness, we must first look to the light, the blinding, sun-drenched glory of ancient Crete. Long before Athens claimed the mantle of wisdom, Crete was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. It was a maritime empire of unparalleled wealth, a civilization where the sea was not a barrier, but a highway for trade and conquest. At the heart of this power sat Knossos, a palace of 1,000 rooms, a sprawling complex of stone and cedar that served as the throne for King Minos. He was a man who walked with the weight of gods in his veins, the son of Zeus himself. But even a son of the sky needs the favor of the deep. To solidify his claim to the throne and prove his divine right to rule over his brothers, Minos turned his eyes toward the churning turquoise waters of the Aegean. He reached out to Poseidon, the earth-shaker, the master of the tides. Minos did not merely ask for a blessing, he asked for a miracle. He prayed for a sign so undeniable that no man could question his authority. He promised the god that whatever emerged from the sea would be returned to the sea in a blood sacrifice of gratitude. The response from the depths was more magnificent than Minos could have imagined. As the waves crashed against the jagged Cretan shoreline, the salt spray parted to reveal a creature of impossible beauty. A bull, white as the crest of a breaking wave, rose from the foam. Its hide shimmered with the luster of pearls, its horns were like polished ivory, and its strength was evident in every ripple of its powerful shoulders. This was the Cretan bull, a living testament to Poseidon's favor. It was a masterpiece of biology and divinity, a creature that seemed to carry the very essence of the ocean's untamed power. The people watched in awe. The miracle was complete. Minos had his proof. His brothers fell silent, and his throne was secure. But as the king looked upon the animal, something shifted within him. The piety that had fueled his prayer began to curdle into a different kind of hunger. He saw the bull not as a debt to be paid, but as a possession to be kept. He marveled at its perfection, its vitality, and its sheer physical presence. He convinced himself that such a magnificent specimen was too precious to be slaughtered, even for a god. In his arrogance, Minos believed he could bargain with the divine. He thought he could substitute the white bull with a lesser animal from his own prize herds, hoping the smoke of the sacrifice would mask the deception. He led a common bull to the altar, its coat a duller shade, its spirit nowhere near as vibrant. As the blade drew blood and the flames rose toward the heavens, Minos stood tall, believing he had outmaneuvered the gods. He thought he could keep the miracle and the crown, enjoying the fruits of Poseidon's gift without paying the promised price. But you cannot cheat the sea. You cannot trick the entity that moves the tectonic plates and commands the storms. Poseidon looked down from the depths and saw the hollow gesture. He saw the greed of a king who valued his own wealth over his word. The god's fury did not manifest as a sudden earthquake or a tidal wave that wiped out the harbor. Instead, he chose a punishment far more intimate and far more harrowing. he decided to twist the king's pride into a curse that would stain his bloodline forever. The white bull, once a symbol of divine approval, was allowed to roam free, becoming a wild and destructive force on the island. But the true retribution was silent and internal. He reached into the heart of Pasiphae, the queen of Crete and wife of Minos. He did not just incite anger or madness, he planted a desire that defied the laws of nature and the boundaries of the human soul. He kindled a flame of unnatural passion within her for the very bull Minos had refused to sacrifice. The king's greed had created a vacuum of morality, and the god filled it with a nightmare. This was the beginning of the collapse. The golden age of Crete, with its sprawling palaces and its mastery of the waves, began to rot from the inside out. The sin was not just in the broken promise, but in the belief that a human could possess the divine without consequence. Minos had chosen a beast over his honor, and now the heavens would ensure that a beast would be his legacy. As the queen's obsession grew, the tragedy moved from the temple to the bedchamber, setting the stage for a birth that would haunt the annals of history. The shadow of the horns was beginning to fall over the throne, a darkness that no amount of gold or stone could ever keep at bay. That darkness did not arrive with the thunder of a foreign navy or the sudden collapse of the palace walls. It crept in through the heart of the queen, a silent psychological rot orchestrated by the very gods Minos had sought to cheat. When the king of Crete looked upon the majestic white bull and decided it was too beautiful to sacrifice, he believed he was keeping a prize. In reality, he was inviting a plague into his bedchamber. Poseidon, sensing the insult, did not strike Minos down with a bolt or a wave. Instead, he reached out to Aphrodite, the goddess of desire, to craft a punishment far more intimate and agonizing. They did not target the king's life. They targeted his pride and the sanity of his wife, Queen Pasiphae. The curse was a fever. It began as a fascination, a wandering gaze toward the pastures where the sacrificial bull grazed. But under the influence of the divine, that curiosity curdled into a relentless, agonizing obsession. Pasiphae, a daughter of the sun god Helios, found herself consumed by a hunger that defied every law of nature and every boundary of human decency. She did not see a beast. She saw an object of impossible, suffocating longing. Night after night, the halls of the palace at Knossos echoed with the silent footsteps of a queen who could no longer find rest in her silk-lined bed. She was a prisoner of a desire she could neither explain nor satisfy, driven to the brink of madness by the gods' cruel irony. To love what should be sacrificed was her penance, and the weight of it was breaking her. In her desperation, the queen turned to the only man in Crete whose mind was as labyrinthine as the gods' own whims. This was Daedalus, an Athenian exile who had found sanctuary at the court of Minos. He was a man of cold logic and peerless skill, an architect and inventor whose hands could make wood breathe and bronze move. To Daedalus, there was no such thing as a moral boundary, only an engineering problem waiting for a solution. When Pasiphae confessed her shameful secret, he did not recoil in horror. He did not warn the king or offer prayers for her soul. Instead, he went to his workshop. He saw a way to bridge the gap between the human and the animal through the cold application of craft. The machine he built was a masterpiece of deception. It was a hollow wooden heifer, carved with such precision that it mimicked the brace of a living animal. Daedalus stretched the fresh hide of a slaughtered cow over the timber frame, ensuring the scent and texture would fool even the most perceptive beast. Inside, he carved out a small, cramped chamber lined with soft fabrics to cradle the queen. It was a vessel of sin, a mechanical surrogate designed to facilitate an act that should have been impossible. Under the cover of twilight, the wooden cow was wheeled out into the meadows where the white bull roamed. Pasiphae climbed inside, folding herself into the dark wooden womb, waiting for the god's plan to reach its terrifying conclusion. The union that followed was a mockery of the natural order. It was a moment where the boundary between the divine, the human, and the bestial blurred into a single horrific act of submission. The gods watched from the heights of Olympus as their trap snapped shut. Minos remained oblivious in his throne room, still admiring his stolen gold, while in the tall grass of the Cretan fields the seeds of his downfall were sown. The white bull, deceived by the craftsmanship of Daedalus, claimed the queen, and the cycle of vengeance was complete. But the gods were not finished with Crete. The punishment was not meant to end with a single night of shame. It was meant to breathe, to grow, and to eventually demand a blood price that would last for generations. 9 months passed in a state of suffocating tension. The queen withdrew from public life, her belly swelling with a secret that no robe could eventually hide. When the labor finally came, it was not the joyful occasion of a royal birth. It was a visceral, agonizing ordeal that terrified the midwives and sent a chill through the palace corridors. The creature that finally emerged was a living contradiction. It bore the powerful muscular limbs of a human boy, but atop its shoulders sat the massive, heavy-browed head of a bull. This was Asterion, the Starry One, though history would remember him only as the Minotaur. He was the physical manifestation of a broken oath, a breathing monument to the king's greed and the queen's forced depravity. When King Minos looked upon the infant, he did not see a son. He saw a mirror. The creature's wide, dark eyes reflected the king's own deceit, and its low, guttural cries were a constant reminder of the god's power over him. It was a monster, yes, but it was a royal monster. Because it was the offspring of the queen and a creature sent from the sea, it could not simply be put to the sword. To kill it would be to invite even greater catastrophe from the heavens. Yet, to let it walk the halls of Knossos was an impossibility. It was a source of infinite shame, a stain on the bloodline that would grow stronger and more violent with every passing day. Minos was trapped. He possessed a shame he could not kill, a secret he could not tell, and a beast that could no longer be contained within the walls of a palace. The shadow of the horns had finally fully descended, leaving the king to search for a way to bury his sin deep beneath the earth. Minos could not simply kill the reminder of his failure, for to spill the blood of the creature would be to invite the further wrath of Poseidon. Instead, he sought to bury the evidence where no eye could ever find it. He turned to Daedalus, a man whose mind operated on a plane of geometry and artifice that bordered on the divine. The king's request was simple in its cruelty: design a house that is also a hole in the world, a place where a man might walk for 1,000 years and never find the sun. Daedalus set to work, but he did not build with the intent of creating a fortress. A fortress implies an enemy outside trying to get in. What Minos required was a structure where the enemy was already inside, and the walls themselves were the guards. This was the birth of the labyrinth. It was not merely a maze in the sense of a garden puzzle. It was a psychological weapon crafted from limestone and shadow. Daedalus utilized a design of such intricate, recursive complexity that it defied the natural laws of navigation. He built corridors that sloped so gently the walker wouldn't realize they were descending into the gut of the earth. He created junctions where the air moved in such a way that it mimicked the sound of breathing, leading the lost deeper into the dark. The architecture was defined by the concept of the infinite. Every path promised an exit, but delivered only a mirror image of the path already traveled. It was a prison without bars, where the only thing keeping the inmate captive was his own inability to perceive a way out. To enter the labyrinth was to lose one's sense of self, as the repetitive nature of the stone blurred the lines between memory and reality. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distorted echoes of one's own footsteps, which the walls would throw back with a slight, mocking delay. Daedalus had succeeded in creating a void in the middle of a bustling kingdom, a dead zone where time and direction ceased to function. While these stone arteries were being carved, the creature they were meant to hold was shedding the last remnants of his humanity. The boy known as Asterion, the Starry One, was gone. In his place stood a mountain of muscle and instinct. The transition from a misunderstood child to a carnivorous titan was a slow, agonizing descent into the primal. The soft skin of the infant had toughened into a hide as thick as a warrior's shield. The human torso, though still upright, was now crowned by a massive leonine neck capable of supporting the weight of the great black horns that curved toward the sky like twin scythes. The horror, however, lay in the eyes. In the early days, there might have been a flicker of recognition, a trace of the queen's lineage in the gaze of the child. But as the beast matured, those eyes turned into dark, unblinking orbs that reflected only hunger and confusion. He no longer understood the language of his keepers. The sounds he made were no longer cries for comfort, but guttural, vibrating bellows that shook the very foundations of the palace floors above. He had become a creature of the dark, his senses sharpening to detect the slightest vibration in the air or the faint scent of something living. This shift marked the moment the tragedy turned into a nightmare. A beast of this magnitude could not be sustained on the scraps from a royal table. He rejected the grains, the fruits, and the cooked meats of civilization. His biology had become something predatory, something that demanded the heat of a fresh kill. The Minotaur was no longer just a secret to be kept. He was an appetite to be managed. The domestic shame of the royal family had evolved into a state-level catastrophe that required a steady supply of living flesh. When the labyrinth was finally completed, the creature was lured or driven into its depths. As the final stone was slid into place, sealing the entrance, a heavy silence fell over the court of Knossos. Minos believed he had solved his problem. He had given the beast his own kingdom, a world of endless gray stone where he could roar until his lungs failed and no one would hear. But you cannot truly bury a sin. You can only give it a place to grow. Deep beneath the floorboards of the throne room, the Minotaur began to pace. He learned the turns of his new world. He learned the smell of the damp walls, and he waited for the sound of the door to open, for the king to send down the first of the many debts that blood alone could pay. The labyrinth was finished, but the era of the monster had only just begun. While the stone corridors of the Knossos maze stood silent, a tragedy was unfolding across the sea that would provide the beast with its first taste of human life. The catalyst for the coming horror was not a monster, but a man. Androgeos, the crown prince of Crete, was the golden son of King Minos, an athlete of such extraordinary prowess that his fame spread far beyond the shores of his island home. When he traveled to Athens to compete in the great games, he did more than participate. He dominated. Every race, every wrestling match, and every display of strength ended with the Cretan prince standing victorious over the local champions. But in the ancient world, such excellence was often a death sentence. King Aegeus of Athens watched his own people's pride wither in the face of this foreigner's success. Whether it was the king's own jealousy or the bitter resentment of the Athenian athletes, a plot was hatched. On the road to Thebes, or perhaps during a hunt for a wild bull, Androgeos was ambushed and murdered. The pride of Crete was snuffed out on Athenian soil, and when the news reached the ears of King Minos, the grief that took hold of him was cold, sharp, and unforgiving. He did not ask for an apology. He did not seek a diplomatic resolution. He demanded a reckoning that would echo through the centuries. Minos launched the full might of the Cretan navy, the most powerful fleet the world had ever seen. The war that followed was less a conflict and more a systematic dismantling of Athenian power. Minos did not just assault the walls of the city. He invoked the gods to bring about a devastating famine and a relentless plague. Athens became a city of the dying and the desperate. When the Athenian leadership finally knelt before the Cretan king to beg for mercy, the price of peace was revealed to be more gruesome than any battlefield. The treaty dictated that every 9 years the city of Athens must send a tribute to Crete. This was not a tax of gold, nor a delivery of grain or oil. It was a blood debt. 14 of the city's finest children, 7 young men and 7 young women, were to be chosen by lot. They were to be sent to Crete as an offering to the Minotaur. These were the children of the aristocracy and the commoners alike, the future of the city, delivered into the jaws of a nightmare to satisfy the vengeance of a grieving father. In the streets of Athens, the coming of the 9th year was a season of terror. This was the era of the blood lottery, a period where the city's vibrancy was replaced by a suffocating collective dread. There were no exemptions for the wealthy or the influential. The names were drawn in the public square, a process designed to be as impartial as it was cruel. Imagine the silence that would grip the crowd as the urn was shaken. Imagine the sound of a mother's scream cutting through the morning air as her son's name was called, or the look of a father realizing his daughter was destined for the black-sailed ship. These 14 youths were not treated as prisoners of war, but as sacrificial animals. They were dressed in fine clothing, a mockery of a wedding celebration, and led down to the harbor of Piraeus. The ship that carried them was outfitted with black sails, a visible signal of the mourning that gripped the city they left behind. As they crossed the Aegean, they were forced to contemplate a death that defied logic, a death in the dark at the hands of a creature that was half man, half bull, and entirely divine wrath. When the ship arrived at the docks of Knossos, the tribute was marched through the city. The Cretan people watched from their balconies, seeing in these trembling Athenians the price of their own king's peace. There was no trial, no opportunity for defense, and no hope of escape. They were led directly to the entrance of the labyrinth, a structure from which no one had ever returned. As the massive bronze doors groaned shut, sealing out the Mediterranean sun, the 14 found themselves in a world of absolute shadow. The air was stagnant, smelling of decay and the heavy, musky scent of a predator. They were now nothing more than prey, lost in a twisting geometric hell, listening for the rhythmic sound of hooves against stone that signaled the end of their lives and the fulfillment of the king's terrible debt. Those rhythmic hooves were the last things most victims ever heard, but for the next group of tributes, the pattern was about to change. Among the weeping families and the somber soldiers of Athens, one figure stood with a different kind of silence. Prince Theseus did not wait for the lottery to choose his fate. He stepped forward and demanded his place on the ship. This was a calculated risk, a move to transform a ritual of slaughter into a mission of assassination. He knew that as long as the Minotaur breathed, Athens would never be free from the shadow of Crete. He promised his father, King Aegeus, that the black sails of their ship, a sign of mourning, would be swapped for white if he survived. If the sails remained black, his father would know that the beast had claimed yet another royal line. The journey across the Mediterranean was not a voyage of the condemned, but a countdown. When the Athenian vessel finally docked at the sprawling port of Knossos, the people of Crete saw something they had not witnessed in years, a sacrifice who walked with his head held high. Theseus was a warrior prince in his prime, a man who had already cleared the roads of Greece from bandits and giants. He was not a lamb for the slaughter, he was a wolf in the fold. From the limestone terraces of the palace, Princess Ariadne watched him. She was the daughter of King Minos, the sister of the monster, and a witness to the internal rot of her father's kingdom. In that moment, the cycle of vengeance met the unpredictable force of human desire. Ariadne's intervention was swift and decisive. She did not wait for the morning of the sacrifice. Under the oppressive heat of the Cretan night, she sought him out in the darkness of his confinement. This was more than a sudden romance. It was a political and personal betrayal of the highest order. She saw in Theseus a way out of a palace built on secrets and a family history defined by shame. She approached him with a bargain that would change the course of the legend. She would provide him with the means to kill her half-brother and navigate the impossible architecture of her father's prison, but only if he took her with him when he fled. Theseus, pragmatic and driven by his own survival, accepted. The first gift she provided was a sword. In most versions of the story, the tributes were sent into the labyrinth unarmed, meant to be hunted like animals. By providing Theseus with a weapon, Ariadne stripped the Minotaur of its primary advantage. No longer was it a predator facing a victim, it was now a duel between two different kinds of killers. But a sword alone was not enough. Many had likely tried to fight the beast before, only to be swallowed by the infinite corridors and the crushing psychological weight of the maze itself. The labyrinth was designed so that even if you won the fight, you would still lose your life to the geography of the stone. You could kill the monster and still die of thirst, wandering through the repetitive geometry of the prison until your legs gave out. This is where Ariadne's true genius emerged. She handed Theseus a simple ball of wool, known in the old tongue as a clue. It was a tool of domesticity repurposed for a descent into the dark. The instructions were simple. Tie one end to the entrance and let the thread trail behind him as he moved deeper into the structure. It was a physical manifestation of memory, a way to anchor himself to the world of the living while he ventured into the territory of the dead. It turned the labyrinth from a supernatural puzzle into a solvable problem. This transaction was the ultimate act of treason. By helping Theseus, Ariadne was ensuring the death of her own kin and the humiliation of her father's reign. She was choosing a stranger over her blood, a future in a foreign land over her status as a princess of the most powerful island in the world. The air between them was thick with the scent of salt air and the metallic tang of the hidden blade. This was not a fairy tale meeting. It was a desperate alliance between two people who were both looking for an exit. Theseus needed to escape the maze. Ariadne needed to escape the palace. As the dawn approached, the Prince of Athens prepared to enter the earth, holding the thread that linked him to his only ally, knowing that his life now depended on the strength of a single strand of wool and the word of a woman who had just betrayed everything she had ever known. Together, they had rewritten the rules of the game before the first step was even taken into the stone corridors. The heavy bronze door swung shut with a finality that seemed to swallow the afternoon sun whole, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. In an instant, the world narrowed to the rough, cold texture of a limestone wall and the thin, cooling trail of wool threading through Theseus's fingers. This was not the open-air combat of the wrestling pits or the heroic charges of the battlefield he had prepared for. This was a descent into a stomach of stone. Every step forward felt like sinking into deep water, where the pressure of the dark began to squeeze the lungs. The air here was different, stale, recycled, and heavy with the scent of damp earth and something sour, like meat left too long in the sun. The silence did not just exist. It pushed against the eardrums until they began to invent sounds of their own. Every heartbeat echoed against the ceiling, sounding less like a pulse and more like a drum calling for a sacrifice. We often imagine the labyrinth as a complex puzzle to be solved, a geometric curiosity, but for those condemned to its depths, it functioned as a sensory deprivation chamber. The lack of any visual markers quickly strips away a person's sense of self. Without a horizon, without the sky, or even the flicking shadow of a torch, the mind begins to fracture. Theseus would have felt his balance falter as the darkness pressed in, making the narrow passages feel as though they were contracting, rib-like around him. The string was his only anchor, a fragile line of sanity in a world designed to induce madness. He was not just walking through a building, he was navigating the physical manifestation of King Minos' shame and the cold mathematical genius of Daedalus. The walls were smoothed by years of desperate hands searching for an exit that did not exist, and underfoot, the grit of the floor felt like ground bone. Then, the quality of the silence changed. It was not a sudden roar, but a subtle shift in the air pressure, a movement of wind where there should have been none. A heavy, rhythmic huffing began to vibrate through the stone, carrying with it the thick musk of an animal. It was the sound of a creature that had never known a mother's touch or the warmth of the sun, only the cold, repeating angles of its prison. Theseus stopped. In the absolute black, his other senses sharpened to a painful edge. He smelled the rot first, the copper tang of old blood, and the remains of the Athenian youth who had wandered these same halls until their legs gave out or the hunger took them. And then he heard the hooves, a slow, scraping sound of bone against stone, hesitant and heavy. This was no choreographed duel of heroes. When the collision finally happened, it was a mess of sweat, fur, and pure desperation. There were no grand speeches or dramatic poses in the dark. There was only the sudden, violent weight of a body 3 times his size slamming into his chest. Theseus felt the hot, wet breath of the beast against his neck, a chaotic mix of human agony and bovine fury. They tumbled across the uneven floor, hands clawing for a grip on wet stone. The Minotaur was not a warrior. It was a confused, starving hybrid acting on pure, distorted instinct. It thrashed with a strength that felt tectonic, its horns scraping the low ceiling and sending showers of grit into Theseus's eyes. The struggle was a matter of inches and breaths. Theseus found the beast's neck, his fingers sinking into the thick, matted hair of its mane, feeling the frantic pounding of a heart that was, despite everything, still partly human. He struck not with the grace of a champion, but with the frantic urgency of a man who knew he would be torn apart if he hesitated for even a second. He used his bare hands, his weight, and the jagged corners of the labyrinth itself to pin the creature down. The final moments were not a glorious victory, but a sickening, muffled sound of bone meeting stone, a sharp crack, a long, bubbling exhale, and then a silence more profound than the one that had preceded the fight. The weight on top of him became dead weight. The heat began to leave the body, and the frantic huffing died away into nothing. In that moment, the Minotaur ceased to be a mythic terror and became nothing more than a pile of meat and bone in a dark room. Theseus lay there for a long time, his own breath coming in ragged gasps, the blood on his hands indistinguishable from his own in the darkness. He had done the impossible, but there was no cheering crowd, no golden light, only the cold thread still gripped in his left hand, reminding him that he was still trapped in the belly of the earth. The beast was dead, but the maze remained, and the long, blind walk back to the world of the living was only just beginning. The silk thread was his only connection to a life he had almost forgotten in the heat of the slaughter. Each tug of the fabric against his palm was a heartbeat, guiding him through the suffocating silence of the tunnels. When he finally stepped into the silver moonlight, his skin was stained with the dark, heavy blood of the creature, and his lungs burned with the sudden intake of fresh, salt-laden air. Waiting there, in the shadow of the stone entrance, was Ariadne. She was the architect of his survival, the woman who had turned against her own blood to ensure his return from the dark. There was no time for celebration, no moment to process the carnage left behind in the belly of the earth. The harbor was a short distance away, and the anger of King Minos would soon be a physical force chasing them across the waves. They fled under the cover of a moonless sky, the Athenian ships cutting through the black water of the Aegean, leaving the cursed island of Crete to the ghosts of the labyrinth. For Ariadne, this flight was the beginning of a new world. She had sacrificed everything, her home, her family, her safety, for the promise of a life in Athens by the side of the man she had saved. But as the silhouette of Crete faded into the horizon, the atmosphere on the deck of the ship began to shift. The adrenaline that had bonded them in the darkness of the palace started to evaporate, replaced by the cold, biting reality of what had been done. They stopped at the island of Naxos to rest, to gather water, and to find a moment of peace after the horror of the maze. It is here that the myth of Theseus the Savior begins to fracture, revealing the jagged edges of a man driven by more than just justice. As the sun dipped below the Aegean, Ariadne fell into a deep, exhausted sleep on the golden sands of Naxos. When she awoke, the morning light was harsh, and the horizon was empty. The ships were gone. Theseus had sailed away in the gray light of dawn, leaving his benefactor alone on a deserted shore, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the memory of her betrayal. This is the moment that historians and poets have wrestled with for millennia. How could the man who stood for the liberation of Athens commit such a profound act of cruelty against the person who made his victory possible? In the traditional heroic narrative, there is a desire to believe in Theseus as a figure of unshakable virtue. We look for excuses. Some versions of the story suggest a sudden, violent storm forced the ships to sea, or that Theseus, in his haste to return home, simply forgot her in a fit of divine madness. but the most enduring interpretations offer a much more complex picture. There is the suggestion of divine intervention, that the god Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a dream, claiming Ariadne for himself and commanding the hero to depart. In this version, Theseus is not a villain, but a servant of the gods, heartbroken but obedient. It provides a convenient out for his reputation, shifting the blame from the man to the heavens. Yet, if we strip away the divine shadows, we find a much darker possibility. Theseus was the son of a king, a man whose future was defined by the political landscape of Athens. Bringing home a Minoan princess, the daughter of the enemy, a woman who had helped kill the prince of Crete, would have been a diplomatic nightmare. Ariadne was a living reminder of the shame of Crete, a woman who had proven she could betray her own father. Perhaps Theseus looked at her on the shores of Naxos and saw not a savior, but a liability. In the cold light of political ambition, her usefulness had ended the moment they cleared the harbor at Knossos. This abandonment transforms Theseus from a binary figure of light into a character defined by ambiguity. It suggests that the same ruthlessness required to navigate the labyrinth and kill the Minotaur was also present in his heart. The beast was dead, but the man who emerged from the maze was not the same man who entered it. He had become a master of the calculated move, a man who could discard a life as easily as he discarded a broken sword. The tragedy of Ariadne is the first crack in the mask of the perfect hero. It reminds us that in the ancient world, greatness was rarely synonymous with goodness. As Theseus sailed toward the coast of Attica, he carried with him the weight of this choice, whether it was forced by a god or chosen by his own hand. The sea was calm, but the air was thick with the scent of an approaching storm. In his focus on the horizon, or perhaps in the fog of his own guilt, he neglected one crucial detail. He had promised his father, King Aegeus, that if he returned successful, he would replace the black sails of mourning with white ones. As the Athenian coastline came into view, the black sails still caught the wind, heavy and dark. This oversight, or perhaps this lingering shadow of his character, was about to trigger a second tragedy, one that would cement his reign in blood and ensure that his homecoming was as bitter as his departure from Crete. He had escaped the belly of the earth, but he could not escape the consequences of the man he had become. The ship cut through the water with a rhythm that should have felt like triumph. Behind them, Crete was a fading bruise on the horizon, its palace of blood and secrets finally sinking beneath the waves. Theseus stood at the prow, the hero of the hour, but his eyes were not on the future. He was a man suspended between worlds. He had entered the maze a sacrifice and emerged a butcher. The air on the open sea was clean, yet it could not wash away the metallic scent of the labyrinth or the heavy silence of the beast he had left cooling on the stone floor. Victory, he was discovering, carried a weight that no one had warned him about. It was a burden that settled in the chest, making the simplest thoughts difficult to grasp. And so, as the familiar crags of the Attic coast began to sharpen in the distance, a fatal oversight took hold. It is one of the most haunting questions in all of mythology. How does a man capable of outwitting a god-built maze forget the one thing that matters most to those he left behind? Before the black-hulled ship had departed Athens, King Aegeus had gripped his son's shoulders and made him promise a sign. If the mission failed and Theseus was dead, the ship would return under the same mourning sails it left with, black as the charcoal of a funeral pyre. But if he was successful, if he had truly ended the tribute and slain the monster, he was to hoist sails of brilliant white. It was meant to be a beacon of hope, a signal that could be read from miles away, long before the ship reached the harbor. but the white cloth remained folded in the darkness of the hold. Perhaps Theseus was blinded by his own glory, his mind already racing ahead to the crown he would soon wear. Or perhaps the island of Naxos, where he had recently left Ariadne, had left a shadow over his soul that he could not shake. Some say the gods themselves cast a veil of forgetfulness over the crew, a divine punishment for the blood he had spilled and the hearts he had broken. Whatever the cause, the result was a tragedy born of silence. The black sails remained unfurled, catching the wind and carrying a lie toward the shore. They were a banner of death flying over a ship full of living men. High above the crashing surf, on the jagged cliffs of Cape Sunion, an old man stood waiting. King Aegeus had not slept well since his son had sailed away. Every morning he climbed to the highest point of the rocks, his eyes scanning the shimmering blue expanse for any sign of a mast. He was a king who had built a city, but his heart was anchored to that one single ship. He watched the seasons shift and the tides turn, his hope warring with the grim reality of the Minotaur's reputation. He knew the odds. He knew that many had gone into that dark place, and none had ever returned. Yet he stayed his watch, a lonely figure etched against the sky, praying to gods who often find more amusement in grief than in mercy. Then it happened, a tiny speck on the horizon. Aegeus leaned forward, his hands trembling as he shielded his eyes from the glare of the afternoon sun. The ship was moving fast, driven by a favorable wind. For a moment, his heart must have surged with a desperate, wild joy. His son was home. But as the vessel drew closer, the color of the canvas became undeniable. It was not the brilliant, blinding white of a victory. It was the deep, oppressive black of a casket. The wind caught the dark fabric, snapping it tight, making the message clear even from the heights of the cliffs. To Aegeus, those sails were not just cloth, they were a death sentence. They were the physical proof that his lineage had ended, that his son's body had been destroyed by the very beast he had sent to face. The grief was not a slow realization, it was a physical blow that shattered his spirit. In that instant, the crown, the city, and the long years of his reign meant nothing. If his son was gone, the world was empty. He did not wait for the ship to dock. He did not wait to hear the stories or to see if there had been some mistake. The weight of his sorrow was too heavy for the earth to hold. With a final agonizing look at the black sails that signaled his ruin, Aegeus stepped off the precipice. He fell through the air, a king transformed into a ghost before he even hit the water. The sea swallowed him whole, his life ending in the churning foam at the base of the cliffs he had guarded for so long. This was the final tax of the Minotaur. The creature was dead, its throat cut, and its body left to rot in the center of a forgotten maze, but its hunger was not yet satisfied. It demanded a price for its ending, a symmetry that the fates insisted upon, a life for a life, a king for a king. The monster was a prince of Crete, a royal secret hidden in stone, and it was only fitting that its death would claim a royal life in return. Theseus had killed the beast to save his people, but his failure of memory ensured that the victory would be stained with the blood of his own father. When the ship finally dropped anchor and Theseus stepped onto the sand, he did not find a city in celebration, he found a kingdom in mourning. The news of his father's death met him before he could even tell the tale of his triumph. He had returned a hero, but he had arrived as an orphan and a leader who had inadvertently cleared his own path to the throne. The sea that had taken his father would forever carry the old man's name, the Aegean, a constant rhythmic reminder of the cost of his neglect. Theseus had escaped the belly of the earth, but the waves had claimed what the labyrinth could not. The beast was gone, but the tragedy was only beginning to take its true shape. The ripples of Theseus's departure had barely settled when the king's fury found a new target. Minos could not punish a hero who had already vanished across the shifting horizon, nor could he bring back the monster that had been his secret shame. Instead, his gaze turned toward the man who had made the miracle of the labyrinth possible in the first place. Daedalus, the master architect, the man of too many secrets, was now a liability. In the mind of the tyrant, the designer of the cage was the only one who could have taught the bird how to fly. To ensure that the secrets of the labyrinth died with its creator, Minos took Daedalus and his young son Icarus and locked them away in a stone tower that scraped the very clouds of Crete. From this height, the island looked like a map and the labyrinth below like a discarded toy. It was a cruel irony for a man of such intellect to be imprisoned by the very geography he had helped define. Daedalus watched the birds circling the parapets, their movements fluid and unburdened by the walls of men. He realized that while Minos controlled the land and the sea, the sky remained an unclaimed territory. This was not just an escape plan, it was a defiance of the natural order. He began to collect what the birds left behind. Every molted feather, every scrap of down was gathered with the precision of a jeweler. Using beeswax and linen thread, he fashioned a set of wings that mimicked the anatomy of the divine. As he strapped the frames to his son's shoulders, the air in the tower grew heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with stone. Daedalus was a father first and an inventor second in this moment. He spoke of the middle path. He warned Icarus that the moisture of the sea would weigh the feathers down, pulling him into the dark water, and that the heat of the sun would liquefy the wax, stripping him of his flight. It was a lesson in balance, a plea for the boy to remain between the elements. But Daedalus, in his brilliance, had forgotten that youth is not an age of balance, it is an age of extremes. They stepped off the edge, and for a heartbeat the world stopped. Then the lift caught them. They were the first humans to see the world as the gods saw it. The terror of the fall was instantly replaced by the intoxicating rush of altitude. Below them, the peasants looked up from their fields, mistaking the pair for deities descending from the heavens. For Icarus, the world of his father, the world of gears, mazes, and stone walls, ceased to exist. He felt the wind rushing through his hair and the sun warming his back. The warnings of the middle path faded. Why stay in the gray middle when the golden heights were so close? He climbed. He soared higher, pushing against the thinning air, his eyes fixed on the blazing heat of the sun. He forgot the tower. He forgot his father's voice. He forgot that he was a creature of the earth, wearing the borrowed skin of a bird. Then the first drop of warm wax hit his shoulder. It was followed by another. The structure began to disintegrate. The feathers, no longer held by the grip of the wax, fluttered away like autumn leaves. Icarus felt the lift vanish, replaced by the crushing pull of gravity. He reached out for his father, but his hands grasped only at empty air. The descent was a violent, screaming arc into the blue expanse of the sea. Daedalus arrived on the shore of a nearby island, his own wings intact, his life preserved, but his soul shattered. He looked out at the waves where his son had vanished and saw the true cost of his genius. This is the recurring shadow that hangs over the entire Minoan cycle. It is a story of fathers who build monsters and then wonder why their children are consumed by them.
Minos, in his greed for power, created the conditions for the Minotaur's birth. Daedalus, in his pride of invention, gave his son the means to touch the sun, but not the wisdom to survive it. Both men sought to master the world around them, to bend nature and the laws of the universe to their will, but they both ended up standing on the ruins of their own legacies. The beast in the labyrinth was dead, but the cycle of hubris continued, proving that the most dangerous monsters are never the ones with horns and hooves, but the ones who believe they can outsmart fate at the expense of the next generation. The sea that swallowed Icarus was the same sea that took Aegeus, a vast, indifferent witness to the wreckage left behind by men who loved their creations more than their own flesh and blood. The story of the Minotaur ends not with a victory, but with the silence of the waves.
But silence is rarely the end of a history. It is merely the soil in which memory waits to be disturbed. While the poets and the playwrights of the classical age were content to let the story of the Minotaur remain a dark fable of hubris and hunger, the earth itself held a more complicated testimony. For over 2,000 years, the labyrinth was considered a literary invention, a psychological landscape rather than a physical one. That changed in the spring of 1900. When an English archaeologist named Arthur Evans first set foot on the island of Crete, he was not looking for monsters, but for the origin of writing. He followed a trail of carved seal stones that led him to a mound known as Kefala Hill. Within days of breaking the sun-hardened crust of the soil, Evans realized he had stumbled upon something that predated the glory of Athens by a millennium. As the dust cleared under the frantic scraping of trowels and the rhythmic thud of pickaxes, the ruins of a massive complex began to rise from the dirt. This was not a fortress or a simple tomb. It was a structure of such staggering complexity that it seemed to breathe with the weight of a forgotten age. Evans had found the Palace of Knossos, the seat of a civilization he would name the Minoans, and in doing so, he found the skeleton of the myth itself. The architecture of Knossos was unlike anything the Western world had seen. It was a sprawling, multi-story network of over 1,000 interconnected rooms, joined by winding corridors that seemed to defy the very concept of a straight line. As the excavators mapped the site, they found grand staircases that descended into the dark, light wells that channeled the fierce Mediterranean sun deep into the interior, and dead-end chambers that felt like traps. To an outsider arriving from the simpler, linear settlements of the Greek mainland, this place would have been an incomprehensible maze. A stranger could wander for hours through the shaded porticos and the storage magazines filled with giant clay jars, never finding their way back to the great court. The theory began to take hold among the researchers that the labyrinth was never a purpose-built dungeon hidden beneath the ground. The palace was the labyrinth. Its name likely derived from the word labrys, the double-headed axe that was found etched into the pillars and stones throughout the complex. This was the House of the Double Axe, a place where the geography was so dense and the ritual life so intense that it became a legend of inescapable entrapment to everyone who did not belong there. As the walls were stripped of their earthen shroud, they revealed a culture that was obsessed with the image of the bull. This was not the mindless, predatory beast of the Greek imagination, but a symbol of grace, power, and religious ecstasy. The frescoes preserved in the dry heat showed young men and women engaged in the most dangerous sport the world has ever known. This was bull leaping. These paintings depict athletes grasping the horns of a charging bull, using the animal's own momentum to flip themselves over its back in a perfect, lethal somersault.
It was a ritual dance performed in the central courts of the palace, witnessed by crowds who saw the bull as a conduit to the divine. This constant, vivid presence of the animal in every corner of the palace, carved into drinking vessels, cast in bronze, and standing as massive stone horns on the rooftops, suggests that the Minotaur was not a mutation of nature, but a centerpiece of Minoan identity. The beast was everywhere because the beast was sacred. This leads to a chillingly plausible explanation for the monster at the heart of the maze. In the ritual life of Knossos, the line between man and animal was intentionally blurred. Throughout the ruins, Evans and later archaeologists found evidence of high-status masks and ornate headdresses. It is highly probable that during the most sacred ceremonies, a high priest or the Minoan king himself would take on the persona of the bull. By donning a heavy mask made of carved wood or precious stone, the human vanished and the god beast appeared. To a terrified captive or a foreign dignitary led through the dim, flickering corridors of the palace at night, the sight of a man with the head of a bull emerging from the shadows would have been a vision of pure horror. This was the Minotaur in his true form, a man-god, the Asterion, wearing the face of the wild to assert his power over the living. The stories of human sacrifice and the tribute of Athenian youth may have been the way distant rival cultures interpreted these brutal, high-stakes ritual games. To the Minoans, the bull leapers were sacred athletes. To the Greeks, they were victims fed to a monster. The truth that Evans uncovered among the stones of Knossos suggests that the myth was a distorted memory of a sophisticated society that lived on the edge of a knife. The Minoans did not fear the beast within the maze. They invited it into their homes and wore its face in their temples. They built a world where order and chaos lived in the same rooms, where the beauty of a fresco and the violence of the bull were inseparable. When we look at the ruins today, we are looking at the map of a civilization that tried to bridge the gap between the human spirit and the raw power of the natural world. The twisting paths of the palace are a reflection of that ambition, a place where one could easily lose themselves in the pursuit of the divine. The legend of the Minotaur is the story of how we remember what we cannot control. It is the shadow cast by a sun-drenched empire, a memory of a time when the king was a bull and the palace was a trap from which no one truly escaped unchanged. The silence of the waves had finally been broken by the stones, revealing that the monster was never hidden away in a cellar. He was standing in the light of the courtyard, waiting for the dance to begin. The sun that beat down upon that Cretan courtyard was not a blessing, it was an exposure. When the monster stepped into the light, the architectural deception of the labyrinth finally failed. For years, the world had been told that the danger was something external, a physical deformity hidden behind thick stone walls, a biological error that had to be contained for the sake of civilization. But as the dust settled and the heavy breathing of the creature filled the open air, a different truth took hold. The beast was not a stranger. He was the fruit of a royal house, the physical manifestation of a king's greed and a queen's forbidden longing. He was the family secret that had grown too large to keep in the basement. This realization shifts the entire foundation of the myth, moving it away from a simple tale of heroes and monsters and into the cold, clinical territory of the human psyche. To understand why this image has persisted for thousands of years, we have to look past the horns and the muscle. We have to look at the labyrinth not as a building, but as a map of the mind. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, spoke of an internal space he called the shadow.
This is the dark cellar of the soul, where we stow away everything about ourselves that we find unacceptable. It is the repository for our aggression, our shame, our animal instincts, and the memories of the things we have done that we cannot justify in the light of day. We all build a labyrinth to house these parts of ourselves. We construct walls of social etiquette, professional personas, and moral justifications. We tell ourselves that the beast is locked away, that it is separate from who we are when we walk the streets or sit at our dinner tables. But the myth of the Minotaur warns us that the labyrinth is a porous container. The creature at the center is not a separate entity. He is fed by the city above. Every 9 years, the youth of Athens were sent into the dark, a recurring sacrifice to keep the shadow satisfied. In our own lives, we feed our shadows with smaller sacrifices, our honesty, our vulnerability, or the truth of our desires. We think we are buying peace, but we are only sustaining the very thing we fear. The Minotaur is the ultimate Jungian archetype because he represents the duality of our nature. He is the bull, the raw, unthinking hour of nature, and he is the man, the conscious, suffering architect of his own isolation. He is the product of a divine curse, yes, but he is also a victim of human architecture. Consider the tragedy of his existence. He was born into a world that had no place for him, named Asterion, meaning starry one, as if his mother hoped he might belong to the heavens rather than the earth. Yet he was cast into the sunless depths. When we talk about the beast within, we often forget that the beast is often a creation of abandonment. In modern storytelling, this theme has become our obsession. We see the Minotaur's ghost in the flickering hallways of the Overlook Hotel, where a father becomes a monster in a maze of his own making. We see it in the sprawling, neon-soaked labyrinths of science fiction cities, where the protagonist searches for their humanity in a world that has reduced them to a machine. We see it in every story where the hero realizes that the villain they have been hunting shares their own blood, or worse, their own face. The labyrinth has evolved from a stone structure in Crete to the complex networks of our modern lives. Our digital spaces, our bureaucratic systems, and our psychological defenses are the new corridors. We navigate them with a sense of dread, always listening for the sound of hooves on the pavement behind us. We use Ariadne's thread, logic, science, and rationality to try and find our way back to the exit, hoping that if we can just follow the string, we can remain untainted by the darkness we encountered at the center. But the thread is thin, and the center is where the truth lives. The enduring legacy of the Minotaur is not found in the victory of Theseus. In many ways, the hero is the least interesting part of the story. Theseus represents the ego, the part of us that wants to kill the problem and move on, claiming the glory of the hunt. But you cannot kill the shadow. You can only integrate it or be consumed by it. By slaying the Minotaur, Theseus did not end the cycle of violence. He merely cleared the way for new tragedies to unfold. The monster was dead, but the impulses that created him remained in the hearts of the kings and queens who governed the world above. We continue to tell this story because we are still the architects of our own cages. We live in a world that demands we present a polished, perfect version of ourselves to the public, while the primal, messy, and violent parts of our nature are forced into the sub-basements of our consciousness. We find the Minotaur terrifying, not because he is alien, but because he is familiar. He is the personification of the moment when the mask slips. He is the representative of the anger we didn't express, the grief we didn't process, and the power we were told we weren't allowed to have. When we look back at the ruins of Knossos, we aren't just looking at an archaeological site. We are looking at a mirror.
The courtyard is empty now, and the stones have been bleached white by centuries of sun. The screams of the victims and the roar of the bull have been silenced by time. Yet the myth remains as loud as ever. It whispers to us in the quiet moments before we fall asleep. It reminds us that every person we meet is navigating their own private maze, trying to stay one step ahead of the thing they have hidden in the dark. The true horror of the labyrinth was never the risk of getting lost. The horror was the inevitability of the encounter. Eventually, the corridors must end. Eventually, the thread must run out. And in that final quiet space, where the walls stop turning, we are forced to stand face to face with the creature we have spent our entire lives trying to deny. We look into those large, dark eyes, and we see the reflection of our own history, our own failures, and our own capacity for cruelty. The myth survives because it is a fundamental truth of the human condition. We do not fear the beast in the maze. We fear that we are the beast.